therapy, those difficulties are always informed by experience of relationship, and the healing work they do will improve their relationships, right? Will be helpful to others. And I think that's a needed perspective in psychotherapy. For Buddhism, I think it's very helpful to not only appreciate our common ground, right, that we all want to be happy, we all want to be free from suffering, but also to appreciate that we do have very personal experience, and that each one of us will go through even very collective forms of suffering in unique ways. So I think that analytic perspective can be helpful to people who practice Buddhism.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. We're going to take a brief break. You're listening to Your Family's Health on the Voice of Nassau Community College at 90.3 WHPC. This is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Gerard along with Stephen and Tiffany, and we will continue talking with Dr. Jennings about her book, To Heal a Wounded Heart, after this short break.
An important message from Medicare. Between your doctor visits, taking the right medications at the right times, and following advice from different doctors, managing 2 or more chronic conditions, like high blood pressure, arthritis, or diabetes, can be overwhelming. But it doesn't have to be. Chronic Care Management Services can help you get the connected care you need by connecting the dots between your medical appointments, pharmacy, and hospital visits. Your doctor will work with you to create a care plan and check in with you between visits, keeping you on track and helping you with your health goals so you can spend more time doing what you love. If you have Medicare, ask your doctor about Chronic Care Management Services and get the connected care you need. For more information, visit Medicare.gov and search for Chronic Care Management.
Paid for by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
90.3 WHPC.
Welcome back to Your Family's Health. This is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Gerard, and I'm here with 2 nursing students, Stephen Hines and Tiffany Yu. And welcome back our guest, Dr. Jennings.
Thank you.
Dr. Jennings, we left with your description about psychoanalysts and Buddhism, and you're just giving us the difference in the two. I wonder how does religion play into to these in contrast?
It's a good question, especially I think for American Buddhists or Buddhists who have been exposed to Buddhism in Western cultures. Often there's what's known as a secularization of the tradition, so an attempt to enter into the practice as a spiritual practice and maybe also a philosophy, but not necessarily a religion. And while I think that can be really helpful for folks, especially if they've had some prior difficulty with religious community or religious mentors, and especially if they've been traumatized in religious life, I really appreciate the need to have some place where they can drop down into their spirituality without all the trappings of religion. But on the other hand, I do think there's a real pitfall of losing some of the greatest gifts of religious life, which can involve a real sense of belonging to something that both includes oneself and transcends oneself. Mm-hmm. And so I like to talk to American Buddhists about how they experience their Buddhist community. Does it feel very secular, or do they feel its connection to its religious roots?
Dr. Jennings, how did you come to develop this integrative therapy? And your colleagues, did they support you within the clinical community?
Well, I think for me, it was very intuitive. I had been practicing Buddhism since I was a child, so I think I was just naturally or organically bringing my Buddhist training into my psychoanalytic training, and into my work with each patient. But the patients didn't necessarily know that I'm a Buddhist. So I wasn't advertising it. I really believed in the analytic idea that we need to hold the space for who the patient is, who they're becoming, and what they need, and not to impose an agenda. On the other hand, I was finding that with most of my patients, in addition to addressing psychological issues, they were also addressing spiritual issues, which I might describe as questions of meaning, right? Where is meaning found? Right? How to integrate it into life, and definitely issues of mortality, right? Fear of our own impermanence. These are really spiritual issues. And so while I didn't in any way want to conflate Buddhism with psychoanalysis, because they're very different methods and they come from very different traditions, I just found myself trying to listen in a way that included my Buddhist training and my sense of what's in each patient.
How important is family when it comes to therapy? Because I myself might want to try therapy, but I don't think my parents may understand. Is it a make or break situation, meaning if the family does not support the person getting therapy, can there still be success?
Yeah, I think that some privacy is usually helpful when people seek out therapy. And I know it's not always easy to find an ideal therapist, but in most cities and towns there are clinics and there are psychoanalytic institutes that run clinics where people can give it a go, right? And I know it's obviously much harder if you're a child, but if you're over 18, most people can just seek out therapy on their own, whether or not their families understand, appreciate its value, right? Mm-hmm. It can be tricky if you come from a family that actively pathologizes therapy. Right, and sometimes that happens, especially if people come from particular religious traditions where they're encouraged to talk to religious mentors about personal problems, or to keep it to themselves. And right, in some families, there's really a strong message that you don't want to expose your suffering because nobody's interested, or you're going to feel ashamed. Mm-hmm. And so that can make it tough to risk, right, reaching out for therapy and beginning to reveal more about what you've been through, but it's worth it.
Now, as a psychoanalyst yourself with a private practice, if your patients do not embrace Buddhism, mm-hmm. How effective is your ability to be able to provide the kind of therapy that is going to be helpful for them?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, and I feel very receptive to working with patients. And I do work with patients from many backgrounds. So I work with patients from all of the great religious traditions. I work with patients who have no conscious interest in spirituality or religion. And I feel very receptive to these various perspectives and backgrounds. I think the way I'm bringing Buddhism into the treatment has more to do with what I see in each patient, which I would describe as a very, very deep and sometimes deeply buried, but nevertheless a part of the mind that has insight, that has the capacity to work through difficult personal experience. And I appeal to those resources in each patient. In Buddhism, we would call that Buddha nature, mm-hmm. but I don't have to call it that, right? I can just call it that part of the mind that has clarity, let's check in with that part. Mm-hmm. Because I believe we all have that resource.
Mm-hmm. A main theme in your book is the risk of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. You suggest that being vulnerable is what makes us human. Can you say more about this and why it can feel too risky to be vulnerable with others? Does Buddhism or psychotherapy have anything to say about this?
Yes. Thank you for the question. It's a theme that is compelling for me because I do think our vulnerability it's just foundational to being a person, right? We're born, we have these very soft bodies. We don't come out with a hard shell, right? And we also come out extremely incapable of caring for ourselves, right? We're not able to feed ourselves. We're not able to get through a single day without someone else who's invested in our survival. Now, we all know this intellectually about infancy, but I think this remains true throughout our lives, right? Because we are relational, because everything we need, right, in terms of care and love and recognition, right, comes from relationship, we're vulnerable because those needs are sometimes frustrated, right? Sometimes we get attached and then we suffer loss. Right? And so often we learn to protect ourselves from that vulnerability, right? Especially if we've been badly hurt early in life. But the problem with that response, which is a human one, is that it mitigates against getting what we most long for, right? Which is an affectionate, attuned response to our vulnerability. Right, to our need for connection and for closeness.
If you wanted to leave, Dr. Jennings, a message to the listening audience, give me what you would leave them with and maybe a sentence or two.
Sure. Well, I think in my experience, most people have suffered, and most people have suffered quite a lot. And I would want to encourage people to stay curious about that suffering, right, without it becoming an obsession, but to really see if it's possible even to respect the suffering. And if it starts to feel like it's getting in the way of living the life you want, right, if you start to feel like it's creating obstacles, then I think it's worth inviting someone else into a healing process. And I certainly believe in the value of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, but also in spiritual community to risk letting people know what you're going through. Because when we start to dissolve that isolation, the chances for healing are tremendous.
Beautiful. Beautifully said. Give us your website. How can people get this book?
Sure. So my website is drpilarjennings.com. The book is also available through Amazon and probably in your local bookstore.
Thank you very much for your time. We want to thank our guest, Dr. Pilar Jennings, for being with us today. And we want to thank you for listening to Your Family's Health.